So when it comes to used or new machine, whether the instructor provides you with one or whether you've purchased a second-hand machine or whether you've purchased a new machine. Let's discuss used machine first. A used machine is most likely already run in unless it's had some form of parts replacement to the hot section. Cylinder, rings, head, all those parts that need time to set. All right. So on the carburetor, you have three settings. You have the idle speed, you have the low setting, and you have the high setting. Idle speed is essential. According to the manufacturer's recommendations, what do you set the idle speed at for the engine to run normally? All right, and they'll give you an RPM setting, but it's not all engines give you feedback. They don't have a display that gives you what the RPM is, and that's why some guys buy third-party gadgets that they could that goes around the coil of the engine of the spark plug so that they can determine what the RPM is. But it's kind of important, and usually there needs to be some way that you could determine that by some third-party application. But let's say, for example, we're dealing with a Nirvana 230 engine. Then your RPM has to be set first. Before you set on anything else in that engine, you set the RPM to 2,850 RPM. Why is that higher than a 200, for example? Because the carburetor was built to deal with smaller engines, and because this is a higher capacity engine, it needs a bit more fuel coming through it, and so the RPM is set a little bit faster. So 2,850 RPM is round about where you want to be on that. So you've set, and this is where I get a lot of guys, for example, they've got a Nirvana, they're at the beach, another instructor comes in, he deals with Parajet, and he grabs the Nirvana, he says, oh, this thing is idling so high, and closes the RPM, the idle to the same as what would be on an Air Conception or on a Parajet 185 Motor, or on a one of the other machines. And you cannot do that. The Nirvana is specifically, because it's also, there's computers involved depending on what model it is, but the manufacturer tells you a certain RPM. If you do not run that certain RPM, you will always struggle with your high and your low setting. So make sure that you use your Engadget or your third-party application, a little device, to tell you what the RPM is of the engine, and it's according to the manufacturer's recommendations. An engine like a 185 Motor will have a much lower RPM. I think it's around 1,400 RPM. I'm not 100% sure. I'll put it up on as a little bit of information on this on the screen here, just to make sure about that. But it's got a much lower RPM than what a Nirvana would run at. It's also a clutch-driven engine, so it just sounds like the whole time like the engine's going to die, but it's not. It's what it should be on the 185. On the 230, it's about 2,850 RPM, and on the 200 Instinct, it's an F-Lite, it's around 2,450 RPM. So you set your idle speed correct. If it came from the factory, don't mess with it. It will be correct. All right, so now you've got your idle speed set up correctly. Now you're going to go first to your low setting. Now your low setting is only for RPM and throttle response. A lot of guys tinker with a high setting and they think that's going to affect how the motor runs when it's not idle. Not at all. High setting is 3,500 RPM and upwards. So the two have got nothing to do with each other. All right, so the low setting, you make sure that you've got two goals when you set that. You make sure that you've got quick throttle response, wham, immediately when you press on that thing, and number two, that it idles smooth like a BMW engine. There's no wah, bah, wah, 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 there's none of that. It's as smooth as a baby's butt. Okay, so that is the ideal situation that you want. If it's a new engine, different story. But if it's a used engine and the rings are already set, it's supposed to run smooth, have good throttle response, and this is usually what I get, is that there's very bad throttle response. So the guy presses the throttle because, or it just goes, it wants to die. Okay, that means the engine's not getting enough fuel, so you're going to open the throttle, open the L setting a little bit. We're literally talking 2 millimeters at a time, or 2 degrees on the watch at a time, until the throttle response is right. and you've got a smooth running engine. If you open it too much, it's going to have a rough idle. It's going to blah, 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 blah. We call it four-stroking. That's the right term. So it is not burning off efficiently the fuel. So you want to have a smooth throttle response, but a smooth idle, but a fast throttle response. Once you got that sorted, you go over to the high setting. My recommendation is to start with a minimum setting of the high setting. If you're at altitude, anything about 5,000, if you're at a 4,000 feet field and above, you go to the minimum high setting, which is on the Instinct, for example, 1 full turn open. So you close the high setting completely. How do you know you've closed it? Well, they sometimes, the manual says clockwise, anti-clockwise. You know what's the best rule of thumb in the field is to make sure that the spring closes. There's a setting, the little nipple, and it's got a spring. If you want to know if you close it correctly, the spring becomes smaller if you close it. And if you want to know if you're opening it up, the spring becomes bigger. Okay, so you close it all the way up. Now you know you've closed it because there's only one way to close it. And now you open it up a little bit to 1 full turn open, not a half turn, a full turn open. That is your minimum setting on, for example, the 230. Now that means that's your most amount of power that you're going to get. The higher up you go, not going to be influenced further on that. And we're going to talk about the fact that if you go down to sea level, now things change. Now, I don't know if I explained this in this video already because the time runs. But the higher up you go, less oxygen is available in the atmosphere than at sea level. Sea level is the most amount of oxygen that you're going to get. Think about a column of air stretching up from the coast all the way up into space. Obviously, there's no air up in space, but there's plenty of air up, and the molecules has a weight. We've got a way of determining that weight. But when you get to higher elevation airfields or fields where you're going to be flying, then there's less oxygen. So therefore, you need less fuel. And there are symptoms of an engine that has been set at coast, but you're flying at high altitude field, will be that the high setting has been opened to give more fuel. So you had a high airfield, suddenly the engine just runs rough. When you go max power, it doesn't have plenty power. And we've already spoken about what the symptoms will be, or what happens on the low setting is that it'll be four-stroking. It'll be rough because it's got more fuel coming in, but not enough oxygen. Okay, so you got to close it up. You'll close that high setting and that low setting according how I explained. If you're at higher elevations, maybe at set and fly always at high elevations, you go down to the coast. Now you might have to tweak it a little bit. And there again, you'll have lots of oxygen, so it means you have to open up the settings, the high setting a little bit. But if you've been at that max, that minimum of the high setting, if you've set at that, most likely you won't have any issues whatsoever. You'll be flying at your max. If you've got a good oil that you're using, you won't have any issues on that engine. The higher performance the engine is, meaning that you're running a Motor 185, it can run up to 8,800 RPM, you're doing strong climbs for acrobatic turns, then you're going to want to tweak that a little bit. So it gives a little bit more fuel so that you do not run a risk of running that engine too hot. Okay, we'll get into the technical side when we start doing servicing as a subject. But the point is I'm explaining the carburetor settings right now. At the coast, more oxygen, settings need to be opened up, needs to be smooth running engine, fast throttle response. If it's at higher altitude elevation, you might have a rough running engine, but you got to close them up because you need less fuel because there is less oxygen, all right? Spoken about. If it's a new engine, you're going to go into a run-in process. Now, for the first 3 hours of the running of the engine, the rings would not have set on that engine yet. And that means getting to between 3 and 5 hours worth of flying, the engine's going to just die on you. It's not going to want to start. You're going to land at some place and it's not going to want to start again. And that means you're going to have to set the carburetor again when you're at that location or wherever you are. Because that is the run-in process. Runs up to 5 hours actually, not just your first run-in. The final set is between that 3 to 5 hours. The run-in process of a brand new engine, manufacturers recommend 1 to 40. 1 to 40 is the oil mix that they want onto that. But I've never done that before, and I've never seen the reason for it, because you're not going to fly the crap out of that engine when it's brand new for the first 3 hours. You're going to try and let it sink in over time. So want to go by manufacturer's recommendations, 100% fine. You're not going to seize the engine. So that is 1 to 50 or 20 milliliters of oil for every liter of fuel that you're going to use. but you can work that ratio out yourself as well. So the guys have got different ways of doing that. So your running process is you alternating 300 RPM at a time. So it's at idle, now you go 300 RPM up for 10 seconds, let go a little bit, wait for 5 seconds, and then go another 3 RPM higher than what you usually did. And so you elevate it, you never take it to the top RPM. So you're going to run that engine in for about 30 minutes by just running it on the ground, and you're playing with that RPM constantly as it goes up, and then you go back down, let it idle for a couple of seconds, and then you take it up at 300 at a time. And so you play with that engine for about 30 minutes before you hit the airwaves for your first takeoff. All right, anyway, you're going to do about 6 to 7 hours worth of flying on your license over your 35 flights, and you're never flying the engine hard when you're doing training. So that usually is, you get over the process of setting your engine in the license period. So that's why it's not really a big deal. It's usually a new engine running process is usually a big deal for a pro pilot. Bought a new engine, so he's worried about that 3 to 5 hours worth of running in the first race or second race or something like that, where he's going to cross that in just maybe one flight. All right, let's get there. Now we're going to get to the wing. I'm putting up the clip here of checking the wing surfaces. If you bought a second-hand wing, now it's very important to understand from the manufacturer's side and also from the servicing side. You've got to check your wing twice a year. It's got to go for an inspection according to regulations here in South Africa, so every 6 months. But not everybody does that, but if you can at least do that once a year, it's good. What happens on these lines is that the lines actually shrink. And it can actually happen at these inspection facilities. They find that the lines on one side is longer than the other side. And it's because a guy usually always turns or spirals in one direction. And usually they turn to the direction that the torque is taking them. And so they find that when they do these inspections, the lines are different at a different length according to how the pilot flies. So the lines actually shrink. And at these facilities, they can stretch them. They put a weight on them, they stretch them, they make them the same length. But you also want to make sure that these lines aren't getting old, and they are as good as they operate at what they were designed for. So twice a year is when that inspection happens. But now let's say you bought a second-hand wing. I would send it in for a porosity test. Now you could buy a wing, a guy tells you, hey man, it's good condition, whatever else, I've almost never flew it. The first rule of thumb in buying second-hand is to treat the seller like, and even if he's your best buddy, you treat him like he's the world's biggest liar, because that's what pilots do. Pilots lie about their flight experience on the machine. They'll never tell you if they seized the engine, and they'll never tell you how many hours they've flown on a wing. That's guaranteed. Your pastor will lie to you. That's just the way it is. All right, just take it. Just write it down on paper, like I said in the previous link. Write it down on paper, read it, recognize it. It's not going to change ever. Okay, so what determines how much time you've got on a wing? So you most likely have about 300 to 500 hours worth of flying, depending on the weather situation, weather places that you fly at. That's the UV effect. That's what deteriorates the wing. But then you get guys that fly 100 hours at the coast and they never wash their wing. There's always salt and water and shit in that wing, and it deteriorates much quicker. I've seen wings with 30 hours on that you could throw away. The porosity test has failed on it. And I've seen wings 15 years old that come with 100% porosity feedback from the test facility, where that wing is just never flown whatsoever, but it's 15 years old. It's like one of the originals. So you don't really go on age. It goes about exposure to UV and sunlight and how that wing was treated and where it was flown. With the porosity test, the manufacturer or a inspection facility, we have a really great inspection facility here in South Africa, and I'm sure all the other countries have the same kind of situation. They'll basically conduct a test to determine how much air passes through the fabric. So they close up the vents around a machine that'll pump the air through that, and how much air escapes. They've got their little gizmos to determine how much of the air escapes, and how much, a wing with great porosity that passes the test with flying colors will be like a solid object passing through the air. So that's pretty much what they try and accomplish with that. And if it's got bad porosity, basically what's going to happen is it's got less lift. You're going to be running your ass off to get into the air, and you're going to be flying much faster than what the wing is designed for. I've been in an Icarus race where guys were flying Hadron XXs, and a pilot with a universal whose porosity, the wing's porosity is completely shot, is basically overtaking guys with hadrons because he's making up with it with power, but the wing is just not giving the lift it should. So the efficiency goes down the drain, and you need a much more advanced pilot to try and pilot something that doesn't have good porosity. So there we go. All right, so we're doing the glider fold out and line checking and surface checking. First up, the glider is laid out in a straight line like this, and basically we have a visual perspective to be able to check all of the top surface. And what you want to look out for is to see if there are any rips within the material. And then I'm just going to mention this now, and then we'll get back to it when we come into the flight instruction side, is the fact that the glider is laid out completely straight, whereas this will not be the way you fold your glider out for takeoff. Now, I've rebuked many professionals on YouTube that lay the glider out like this for takeoff, because this is what happens is when you actually take off with this. We're going to get to this when we do the flight training, but when you pull the line straight now, these tips will come and fold over like this, and that's not what you want. This is the way we do it for the surface check, just to make sure that the surface is fine, and then we can pick up the lines. Right, here we go. Now, to be able to check the lines, you can already see this is a brand new glider, but for some reason the O-ring, this is a rubber O-ring that protects the line, is missing from this carabiner. I don't know why that is, but this would be one of the first things to fix. The reason why you want those little O-rings, rubber O-rings in place, is because it keeps the line in place, and if you constantly have to do this, you are wearing out in these lines. Now, these lines are made of I've got a polyester sheathing over a Technora internal core. Technora is a material closely associated with DuPont's Kevlar, so Kevlar basically, and it's a good material for lines. But what you have to realize about these lines is the fact that they need to be, we're going to get into when you do the checks on these gliders, but when you select a glider or you're looking at a glider to purchase one, the best first step would be to send it for a service. We'll talk about that in a theoretical session. But once a year, if this goes to the factory, at least once a year, they can check the length of these lines, they can check the condition of these lines. And when I say length, that is not over exaggerated, because what actually happens is these lines shrink, and you actually want them to be a correct size on length on both sides, so they stretch the lines if they have to at a factory facility. Now, the thing I need to show you on the line check is for when you do the visual on the riser, see if there's any damage to it. You have a look at the buckle, see if there's any damage to the buckle, because if there's a lot of damage on the trimmer, on this trim strap, these buckles might not grab, they will slip. Now, this is brand new, so it wouldn't produce any slip. And the next step we're going to get into is checking the line condition internally of all of the lines. So what you'll do is you'll run your finger along the line for the entire length, and if you feel a little bit of a depression, it means that that inner Kevlar core or Technora core has been damaged, and this is the only real way that you could detect if a line is damaged, with this sheathing over it. Now, what you can get is you can get a propeller chop on the line, and basically what will be the case is that the sheathing might be broken, but the Kevlar inside, or the Technora inside, might be still in good condition. So if you have a damaged sheath, you have time to replace it, but it's not critical. But if the internal Technora is damaged for some reason, because of a lot of bending and a lot of stretching and a lot of abuse or something that's happened to it, the sheathing might survive, but the technora might be damaged on the inside, and that is critical because it's difficult to detect. So your first check is to make sure all of these lines are in good shape. All right, so you do all the lines. I don't have to do it on this glider, but this is the process that you would take to make sure that all the lines are fine. And the other thing that I have to mention about this is actually when you do pick up the riser like this, it's quite easy to detect if there are any issues with broken lines. You can see the cascade of lines from your A's all the way down to your D's. And here is your A lines. These are your most critical lines, I would say, on the glider. They go to your leading edge. And then you have your, this is what we call a secondary. You actually have it as an additional A strap on the solar for a beginner glider, but here it's separated. So these are both A's. Then you get to your B in the cascade, your B line, and then you have your C. They're actually nicely marked in this glider, and then your D is your rear set of lines that run to the trailing edge of the glider. Like I mentioned to you on the trim sets over here, that's for full speed, that is for close speed. If you open it up like that, that's called your trim speed. So remember that is referred to as trim speed. You close it, that's your takeoff speed that you want to have for your takeoff run, and obviously your brake toggle. So you want to make sure that the brake lines, that's something you can catch easily on in an incident, with a prop, the line that hits the prop. Most likely that the line that will be damaged would be the outer line going for your tip steering. Most beginner gliders, you can have something like the Solar that has a tip steering line, but then other birds, it'll just have a main brake line. So you want to check both of these lines and make sure that they are in good nick. All right, so we've checked the lines. Technically we would. Like I said, what you need to look out for when the glider is folded out is you have to make sure about that surface and make sure there are no cuts. Now it's still airworthy if it's got cuts in it, but you don't want to buy a glider, you don't want to fly a glider that's got damage, and if it does have damage, all you have to do is send it to a facility where they can patch it, fix it, and be as good as new. All right, next thing would be walk to the center part of the glider. Just going to bump it here, never step on your lines. Bringing the wing across. So this isn't important for the line part, we finished with that. Important to remember that I'm not doing a factory check here. This is you as a pilot. What are your checks on your glider? Right. Easy enough to have a visual inspection of the top surface to make sure there is no damage on that. This obviously is brand new glider, hasn't really flown, and it's a perfect surface, but you might find situations where there is a tear in it that the pilot, the seller might not have been aware of. All right, we've had good talk about the checks and the run-in. The fuel mix, the 1-to-50 fuel mix is the standard fuel mix. If it's a used engine, you're going to have a 1-to-50 or 20 milliliters of oil for 1 liter of unleaded fuel. Now there is discussions in the US, for example, about methanol, the different types of fuel that can be used with the paramotor. I'm not going to get into that because I'm not an expert in the fuel and all over the world. Unleaded fuel, petrol, what kind of fuel will be best? What's the cleanest for your engine to use? I think that is more something specific that you need to discuss within your community. But I can tell you that the best oil to use if you are not running at, well, I would even argue that engines that even go over the 8,000 RPM mark will still be fine with the Motul 710 oil. If we get into the oil discussion, I think that needs to be a separate topic because we're going to talk about fully synthetic oil and synthetic oil. a non-synthetic oil or mineral oil. We're going to talk about those two concepts, and I think that deserves a proper discussion when which is best. It's not something where I just mention a brand name and you're good to go. I don't think that would be appropriate at all. So we'll get into that. We've done the line check. I've put the video up on the line check, and you guys know how to do the line check. We've done the surface check and why it's important. I can put 50 holes through the wing with an AK-47. It'll still be flying 100% perfect, but it doesn't mean that it's the ideal situation to have. You want to patch up those holes. The manufacturer can do it for you. An inspection facility can do it for you, and you also get a patch kit that you could order. It usually comes with the wing. You get some patches and you patch it from the inside of the wing, and you press the fabric onto the patch, and you'll be able to close it yourself. So make sure you patch those holes. You don't want a wing that's got holes in it. That is numero uno. I think that's the most important thing. Trimmer health. Now, if you look at the trimmer strap, I did cover that in the video a little bit, but you'll see the trimmer strap being worn out, and there's some little stitches where the buckle is supposed to hook onto. It's the little black stitching onto the trimmer line. And so usually a good wing that's got plenty of speed built into it, that's usually your cross-country wings. Have got long trimmer line. Sport wings have shorter trimmers. So a long trim line usually has those little stitchings into it, so the buckle grabs onto it. There's a lot of wing. The more the wing load is, the heavier you are on that wing, the more pressure is going to be on that buckle to stay onto that trimmer, the trimmer line, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so what is important about that is if a wing that's been used a lot with trimmers open, trimmers closed, trimmers open, trimmers closed, those buckles don't grab on nicely to the trimmer line anymore. And you can replace that. You can order a replacement trimmer line, and you can send it to a facility where they can just stitch it back onto it. And the buckles are really important. Good buckles are coming out these days, so most likely the manufacturers will provide you with a stronger buckle set if it's a high wing load. A trainer glider is not so important. There's not a lot of pressure on those trimmers. Usually you can open those one at a time, but you'll want to close them. You want, by technique that you learn from the beginning, is opening them and closing them at the same time. All right, so the last piece of stuff that we're going to talk about, the last topic, is going to be the helmet and radio combination. Depending on what region of the world you are, for example, in the regulated airspace that we are, you have radios that you've got to use if you're above a certain altitude. I would argue that you always fly with an aviation radio so you can communicate with other aircraft. That means that you need a restricted radio license, and therefore there's plenty of accidents that could have been avoided if pilots had radios. It doesn't mean that the regulator tells you to have one. I think that it is just mandatory thinking that you should have one, especially in our country where I teach the students, you're not taking off the ground unless your comms are good. So from an instructor's perspective, I use two forms of communication with my students. I've got a Bluetooth headset that I wear that's got a Bluetooth communication with a student helmet. If he purchases a helmet, I can have communication with that. Very important that Bluetooth systems, whether you buy a Cena or a PPG Smoke or a Nirvana Bluetooth system, they will not communicate with each other. So you need to have the same combination. That's why an instructor gives you the same kind of Bluetooth comm, but they don't do it. And I think I'm the first instructor that uses that system where I use Bluetooth. I've never seen another instructor do it. But radios wise, that's easy because it gives you a helmet with a radio link. If it's a good helmet with a good radio link, you're set. Get a good helmet on your head. Now, I cannot stress this enough. Your flying experience is determined by the cheapest piece of kit that you're wearing. Whether it's your boots or whether it's your helmet. If it's a piece of crap, it's going to ruin your flight experience. So don't save money on the small stuff. Sweat it, definitely. Sweat the small stuff. Get a good helmet that's got good communication. You can, with the advantage of the Bluetooth systems, that you can entertain yourself on the long flights. For cross country, for example, that's kind of like a big plus. But for the teaching wise, the instructors use that. This instructor uses that. So let me get into it. A good radio brand, for example, that we use in South Africa, and the reason why we use ICOM, and it's the most popular radio in South Africa, people are fighting or killing each other for these things, is because it's a 6-watt transmitter on these expensive machines, so they can actually communicate line of sight quite well. And you got better chances of being able to reach other aircraft with a stronger transmitter. Now the cable is important. What kind of cable are you using it? So replacing it. If you damage the cable because you've yanked on it, forgot to pull it out, you break the cable, how easy can you replace it? I only sell helmets that I have a warranty on and radio systems that I have a warranty on a cable. So there's something wrong with a cable, I can get one from Nirvana, no problem. The same thing will happen with PPG Smoke. I believe that they are making radio cables now. However, I will tell you that they do not make a radio cable for the ICOM. And the problem with that is that we have to order it from Wild Talk in the UK, and that is an incredibly expensive cable, and it is not half as robust as the Nirvana cable. So we're hoping to see some improvement with that in the future as that rolls out. But yeah, get a good cable that goes with the helmet that can easily be replaced, and make sure that helmet sits well on your head. Helmet, for example, with the Nirvana helmets, for example, I can remove the sponges, and I can, for a small head, I can put some big sponges in. For a big head, I can put small sponges in. The other way around. So a small head, I can put big sponges in. For a big head, I can put small sponges in. I'm screwing myself up here. Yeah, it's good to have a helmet that sits well on your head, that won't ruin your experience. No comms, no flying, in my opinion, especially when it comes to training. There's either good, if the battery's dead on the radio or on the Bluetooth, no go. I've had the radio fail plenty of times, and then I switch over to Bluetooth. And when I was using either one of these two and not using them in conjunction with each other as a backup system, I've had issues. And then it goes over to sign language. And I have to try and get the student onto the ground with sign language, and that's a good backup. That's part of the teaching, and we'll get into that. But if you got good comms, why you need to mess around with freaking backup systems? Get it right from the first time around. All right, guys, that is class 1. I think we've covered plenty of the getting your equipment ready. And then the first section, the class 2, will be getting into being on the ground for your first training session on pulling up the wing, etc. And then we'll see where it goes from there. Adios.